Well, welcome to the third of our series of True Life videos, where we're taking some of life's big questions, seeing how they've been answered down the centuries, and each week too, focusing in on the ancient wisdom of the Bible and the teachings of Jesus Christ. I hope each time to show how Jesus' answers to these huge questions are both true and rational, but also life-giving and good. We've thought already about who we are as human beings. What does it mean to be human? We've thought too about whether there's a purpose to life, a meaning in all this madness. And this week I want to focus in on the question, what's wrong with the world? What's wrong with the world? To get us thinking, come with me on a journey in time as well as space. Let's go first of all to ancient Britain, about 2,000 or so years ago. As we look out the window of our TARDIS, we see a religious ceremony is taking place, but we're in pre-Christian days. It's a druidic ceremony, and at the centre, the chief druid is about to sacrifice a human being. What do you shout out the window? So stop. Why? He says. What would you say? Let's zoom forward in time and across the continents and come to India in the mid-19th century. There we're going to meet Sir Charles Trevelyan, a good Victorian who's been sent out to rule the empire. Sir Charles is horrified when he discovers the practice of sutti. In this custom, when a woman's husband dies before her, she is put alive on the funeral pyre and burnt to death. What do you advise Sir Charles to do? Should he impose his English moral values and stop the practice, or should he let them express themselves, as they have done in their culture? Or finally cross the oceans again, but let's stay roughly in the middle of the 19th century, and come to America, where the vast majority of the majority population, the white Americans, are absolutely convinced those of a different skin colour are somehow inferior to white men and white women, and therefore that these others ought to be subjugated and segregated, perhaps even enslaved. Or when you make your case at the civic meeting as to why this needs to change, on what grounds are you going to make your case? Over the last few weeks, we've been looking at three main worldviews, three main understandings of the world, that of materialism, mysticism, and that of Christianity. And materialism, you might remember, says that all we are meat robots. You are what you eat, in other words. We're just packages of molecules, protons, electrons, neutrons. Of course, the materialist says there are no rules. There are no rules. How could there be? The universe is just one cold accident. Where could we have any kind of rules above us to tell us how we ought to live? No, the universe just is. You wouldn't, after all, accuse a lion that maims another lion in the pack in order to establish his place of committing any kind of crime. Nor a rock that tumbled down a cliff face and split another rock in two. No, both are just doing what they're doing. They just are. Fundamentally, for the materialist atheist, there's no difference between the human being, the lion, and even the rock. We're all just matter in motion, chemical equations buzzing away. Darwin himself spotted this in one of his notebooks in 1838. He wrote this: "Our descent is in the origin of our evil passions. The devil under the form of the baboon is our grandfather." See what he's saying? Essentially, my baboon genes made me do it. Richard Dawkins, a very prolific atheist writer, put it even more clearly, I think. He uses the example of Fawlty Towers, a sitcom from the 1980s. The main character, Basil Fawlty, is this hapless hotel owner, and in one episode he's trying to get to a posh dude, but everything keeps getting in his way, and eventually his car breaks down, and so he starts berating the car. "What are you doing? Why are you doing this to me? What do you think you're playing at? Start now or you'll really pay the consequences." And when the car fails to start, he disappears off screen, comes back with a big branch, and beats the car. We laugh, says Dawkins, because the car's not responsible. Is it? It's not a moral agent. It's not choosing. It's just, well, acting. But, says Dawkins, why don't we laugh at judges when they find criminals guilty? Doesn't a truly scientific, mechanistic view of the nervous system make nonsense the very idea of responsibility, he says? In other words, in a materialist understanding, there is no such thing as evil. It's just the way the universe is. But this is a huge problem. A huge problem. Dawkins himself spots it a little bit at the book launch, for the very book in which he wrote this. A journalist said to him, well, if we're not responsible for what we do, good or bad, then why should we praise you for this book? And Dawkins kind of laughed and said, well, I see the inconsistency, but we sort of have to live with it. Otherwise life would be intolerable. That's not good enough. This man who says we must be rationalists and thinking then takes this leap in the dark. I'll just live with the inconsistency. But actually this worldview is, well, it's dangerous. Here are the words of Viktor Frankl. Who Viktor Frankl is will become clear as I read. He said this, when we present man as an automaton, a robot, in other words, of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of instinct, heredity, and environment, we feed the nihilism to which modern man is in any case prone. I became acquainted, he goes on, with the last stage of that corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I'm absolutely convinced, he concludes, that the gas chambers of Auschwitz and Treblinka and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry or other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. If all we are is meat robots, if our only ethic is the survival of the fittest, then why shouldn't the strong oppress the weak, the mighty kill the poor, the Aryan slaughter the Jew? It is a deadly worldview, a despicable worldview. As Dostoevsky said, if God is dead, everything is permitted. Well, thankfully, we live in a society that has largely turned their back on this kind of materialism, this hard atheism. It's dead both in the halls of academia and universities and out there on the streets too. Where have we turned? Well, we've returned back to religion, not the 6 big traditional religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Sikhism and Hinduism, but rather to a kind of mysticism, as we've been calling it in these videos. If materialism says there are no rules, mysticism says, well, your heart is the rule. Your heart is the rule. You be you. You do you. Follow your heart. Be yourself. Express yourself. You mustn't, we're taught, look out there to rules. Don't be controlled by your parents, or by religion, by a priest, or imam, by a holy book. No, you must follow your own heart. Do what comes from within. Perhaps the Queen, the patron saint of this worldview, is Elsa of Arendelle. What does she sing? Well, she says this: it's time to see what I can do to test the limits and break through. No right, no wrong, no rules for me. I'm free. We're all free. And the worst thing you can do is tell someone else what to do. You've no right. No right to oppress them with your words. No, they must flourish and let whatever's within come out. That is how we're guided. Your heart is the rule. But actually, I want to suggest to you that this is disastrous. Every bit as disastrous, in fact, as materialism. It does tremendous damage, first of all, to society. This idea of following your heart has no answer to the problem of when two people clash with their different desires. Who wins? How do you decide? If we're all just following what comes from within, but there is no guiding principle over all of us. You might say, well, the key rule is you can do what you want as long as it doesn't harm others. But where does that rule come from? What about the person whose desires say they're willing to harm others, to oppress others, either physically or with words? Why shouldn't they? In the words of Professor Arthur Leff, who teaches at Yale, the big problem with all these worldviews is simply two words. Says who? You might think it's nice that we shouldn't oppress other people, but when someone disagrees, who says we shouldn't? So this idea of following our hearts damages society and also damages other people. Ultimately, it is a selfish worldview. We're driven not by concern for other people, but by ourselves. I must do what I think is right. I must do what will make me happy. And it's damaging. Sometimes the way it's damaging is obvious. We have sexual desires, and we follow them without care for the consequences. Perhaps it's just putting on pornography. But actually the pornography we're consuming comes at great cost to others, but primarily the actresses within it. You can read horror tale after horror tale of these poor women often trafficked and exploited by powerful men, vomiting between scenes as they're forced to do things they really hate for the entertainment of us and our desires. Or perhaps at a seemingly more respectable level, there's the dad at work. He's been married 20 years now, a couple of children, but he begins to have a bit of an attraction to the younger colleague at the desk next door, and she seems to respond. Well, says society, you must follow your heart. You must be happy. You owe it to yourself. And so he follows his desires, follows his heart. Of course, leaving the wife and children weeping at home. To follow your heart is ultimately selfish, self-motivated. C.S. Lewis, the author, saw this. In one of his stories, he kind of retells that the first story in the Bible. In the Bible, you might know that the whole story begins with Adam and Eve in paradise, the Garden of Eden. And in slips the snake, the devil character, the Satan character, to tempt them to ruin everything by taking a fruit that's off limits. Well, in C.S. Lewis's retelling, that's sort of set in a space world, instead of offering a forbidden fruit, the devil character offers Eve a mirror. He wants to get her to start looking at herself rather than out there at the world, to thinking about what's best for her rather than how she can serve others. It's a clever take, and making actually exactly the same point as the Bible story. We are built to serve others, and yet we follow our hearts, and we're selfishly following our own desires. It damages society, it damages others, and to follow our hearts even damages ourselves. It doesn't lead to the freedom we think it should. In some ways, again, this is obvious. We start watching pornography and we get addicted. We start drinking and we get addicted. We can't control our desires. We can't control our hearts. If you're master of your own emotions, master of your own heart, then try just for a week, going a whole week without ever lying, without ever lusting, without ever getting angry or jealous. We just can't do it. We command our hands and they move, our fingers and they wiggle, but we can't command our own hearts. We're controlled by our hearts. They master us rather than us them. Even in seemingly kind of respectful ways, this power that our desires have over us is seen. I think back to university, and when I first turned up on our first night, in fact, we were shown a video of the accommodation in which we were staying. The year before, it had been set on fire, and that the fire had been pretty devastating, pretty serious. So we were sternly warned that if ever the fire alarm went off, we were to get out of the building straight away. Well, unsurprisingly, 4 or 5 weeks later, the fire alarm did go off, and we all dashed out of the building, putting on hoodies and jumpers and dressing gowns, and gathered on the lawn outside. All that is, except Cynthia, her real name. Cynthia had remained inside. It's not that she was asleep, but rather she spent 30 minutes getting herself ready, doing her makeup, her hair, choosing an outfit, and then finally came out. When asked why it had taken her so long, she explained, I couldn't possibly come outside before I'd done my makeup. I couldn't possibly let you all see me until I'd sorted my hair. And there was someone who wasn't at all free. She was controlled by her desire to appear beautiful. Our desires control us. And at the end of the day, if we're honest, our hearts are murky places. Jesus himself knew this. He saw it. He said this: it's from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, and folly, foolishness. All these come from within. Jesus knows our hearts, knows what we're really like. Can you imagine if everything you've thought today or the last week or the last month was shown as a kind of video on the wall behind me? You'd be horrified. All of us would. We wouldn't want our friends, our family to see it. No, our hearts are dark, murky places. Following our hearts is damaging all round. What if materialism says there are no rules? If mysticism says love is the rule, if mysticism says our heart is the rule, finally Jesus says love is the rule. Love is the rule. When he's asked to summarise what God wants from us, Jesus said that the great commandment was this: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and to love your neighbour as yourself. And when he was asked to clarify who was meant by our neighbour, he said more or less it's anyone you come across. Love other human beings, whether they be friend or foe. In other words, we're not to be motivated by selfish desire, following our heart, but rather to think about how we might live for the good of others. The dad in the office who begins to be attracted to another woman, therefore quells that desire, because it is a wicked desire, and instead commits in love to caring for and nurturing his family. I wouldn't want to imply the Bible is just a book of rules. There's far more to it than that. In fact, the most significant things are not so much the rules as the rescue and the forgiveness on offer to those of us, all of us in fact, who have broken those rules. But the rules still matter, and they're there for our good. Often God is portrayed as a kind of killjoy. Particularly Christians' attitude to sex is one that the world looks at today and thinks is mad. Actually, Christianity and the Bible are very pro-sex. But it's got to be used in the right way. It's a gift to be enjoyed in the right place. In that sense, it's a bit like fire. Fire is a good thing, but so are the rules that control how we use it. If I was to pick up a burning stick and say, don't tell me how to use fire, don't put your rules on me, I'm going to put it anywhere I like, on the curtains, on the flyer, on the floor, on the kitchen, on the cushions, well, pretty soon it'd be a mess, wouldn't it? I wouldn't be free. I'd be in great trouble. Also, too, with sex, God does say it's to be used in marriage. And that marriage is male and female. But that is for our blessing, not to restrict our fun, our satisfaction, and our freedom. God's rules simply are to love one another and to love him. And in this way, Jesus says, you will find true freedom. Now, that's the irony. When we stop living for ourselves, we actually find true satisfaction and true freedom. Of course, we can ignore God for a while. He has, in a sense, given us the freedom to do that. But when we do, we're free in the same way that an orangutan jumping out of a jumbo jet at 40,000 feet is free from the law of gravity. I might enjoy the rush for a while, the buzz, the excitement, but there will be consequences. Also to us, because God has told us how we ought to live. We will one day have to give an account to him when we die. The reason there are rules above us, standards that apply across time and across countries, is because there is a person above us, the God who made us. That's why it's wrong, in whatever century, for a druid to commit human sacrifice, for a man to exploit a woman, for one race to subjugate another. Jesus came so that we could have life to the full, he taught us. But of course, we've made messes of our lives, all of us, whether we count ourselves as religious or not. Our hearts are murky and grimy, dirty water. But thankfully, there is hope. And that's the question I want to return to next time. Is there any hope? And where are we going?